I have on the screen now what's been marked as exhibit number 9 that you've identified as a photo of a drawer in the kitchen, correct?
Correct.
Is that how you observed the drawer when you documented the scene?
Yes.
And why did the drawer stick out to you as something to document in the scenario?
Again, we're looking at knives in the area. It's just, again, I'm not sure what to call it. It's just a holder in the drawer that contained utensils, including knives.
So after you documented it as you saw it walking into the kitchen, did you do anything else to further identify what was inside of that drawer?
I'm sorry?
After you photographed the drawer itself as you saw it walking into the kitchen, did you do anything to the drawer to further identify what was inside the drawer?
I mean, I would have looked in the drawer and looked at the knives and just examined them.
And so in order to look in the drawer, what do you have to do?
Open it up.
Okay. And do you recall if you photographed the inside of the drawer?
I believe I did, yes.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Can I show you a photo?
Yeah.
Is that familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
And what do you know that photograph to depict?
That's the inside when the drawer was fully opened.
See which one it is? Okay.
The fully open drawer photograph will be marked as Exhibit 10.
And Trooper now showing you on the screen what's been marked as exhibit number 10, the drawer that you've identified that you opened. When you opened the drawer, did anything stick out to you inside of the drawer based on your response to the home on this particular night?
Yes.
What stood out to you?
There was some missing spots where some of the knives would have been stored.
Okay, and towards the rear of that drawer, it's a little hard to see. Was there something towards the rear of the drawer that caught your attention? If you need to stand up for the court's permission.
Yes, and you can also give him the actual photo if he needs to look at that, because it's pretty dark on the screen.
It appears that there's a knife that's out of place in there.
And so did that
Objection as to out of place.
All right, can you describe what you mean by out of place?
Yeah, so it appears that there's a knife. It's just kind of on top. It's not in a set position. It's not in the butcher block. It's not in an area where the utensils are held. It's just sitting on top of everything.
Move to strike areas where utensils are held. He doesn't have a basis of knowledge about how they keep their drawers, Your Honor.
All right, I think the jurors can divine their own conclusions with regard to the picture that's before them. I'll strike that last photo. Not the photo, the last testimony.
Trooper, when you made observation of that item at the rear of the drawer, did you do anything with that particular item to further document the item itself?
I would have taken just close-up photos of the knife.
Okay. Is there any circumstance where you would have to manipulate the item in order to get a better view of it?
If I couldn't get a photograph, if I was trying to photo it, I would have to, if it was, maybe tucked underneath there and it wasn't able to be photographed, I would have had to move it.
Okay. May I approach again?
Yes.
Show you another photograph.
Okay.
And is that photograph familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
And what do you know that photograph to depict?
That is, again, the knife moved in such a manner where I could get a good photograph of it.
And so did you yourself move the knife to photograph it?
I believe I did, yes.
I would object based on what we talked about before, but now also relevance.
All right, I note your objection. I overrule it. A photo of the close-up of the item will be marked as Exhibit 11.
And just showing you again what's now been marked as exhibit number 11. Is that the knife that you moved to photograph?
Correct, yes.
Going back to the dining room area, did you do anything to identify any particular items in the dining room area that were of interest to this particular case?
Yes, I did.
What did you do?
There was I don't recall exactly what was written on it, but there was a box of additional knives in the dining room area.
And when a particular item is noted and chosen kind of for the potential for further examination, do you, as a crime scene services tech, do something to mark it or identify the area?
I do.
What do you do?
We put down what's called a placard. It's just basically just a piece of plastic. It has a number on it that's used to identify what piece of evidence that is.
And in this particular circumstance, when you were at Marine Street on January 28th, was there a placard enumerated by placard number 1?
Yes, there was a placard 1. And
what item was documented at placard number 1, if you recall?
The placard number 1 was the knife on the floor there.
May I approach?
You may.
Showing you another photograph from there.
Yes.
Is that a very accurate representation of what was documented at placard number 1?
Yes, it is.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 12.
And if I just may publish Exhibit 12 to the jury.
You may.
And Trooper, what was there a placard number 2 on scene?
Yes, there was.
And what item was identified at placard number 2?
Placard number 2 was one of the knives that I talked about that was contained in that box.
And where was the box located?
It was located on the dining room table.
Can I approach the witness?
You may.
Another photograph, Trooper. Is that a fair and accurate representation of what was identified at placard number 2?
Yes.
I'll move to witness as the next exhibit.
I would object and ask to be heard at sidebar.
Certainly.
Your Honor, may that be marked as the next exhibit?
The photo of placard number 2 is admitted as marked and admitted as Exhibit 13.
And if I may publish that for the jury.
You may.
Thank you. Trooper, when you were making note of the item at exhibit number 2, that knife on the dining room table, did you make any observations of the knife itself?
Of that knife in particular?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And what observations did you make?
We noted there was some sort of a substance on there.
Okay. And so as a result of noting the substance, is that what made you flag it as placard number 2?
Yes.
Now, Trooper, you've also testified that in this case, a video of the entirety of the house inside and out was done.
Correct.
And you yourself went through the entire house with the other troopers, Trooper Watson and Sergeant Bankston.
Correct, yes.
At this time, Your Honor, I would like to play the crime scene video.
Any objection to that?
With the provisos that we mentioned before, no.
And I do have to offer as an actual exhibit the video itself, and that would be admitted subject to redaction.
All right. So it will be admitted subject to redaction. And let me explain to the jury what redaction means. Redaction just means that there's something that's been taken out of the video. And the reason that it's taken out of the video is it's not relevant to your decision making. And the early remarks of the case, that one of my jobs is to make sure that everything you see and hear inside the courtroom is relevant to your decision making. Some portion of that video was not, and it's been removed. Everyone see the video?
Objection. Can I just,
Yes,
May I continue?
you may.
Thank you. Trooper Laughlin, did you, other than documenting the scene, did you collect any particular items from 679 Moraine Street on January 28th, 2021?
Yes, I did.
What items did you collect?
I personally collected placard 1 and placard 2, the 2 knives. That's one. Okay.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
Trooper, I'm just presenting you with an item if you could examine the item in the box.
That's all right. Hold on. Maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Is that the item collected on January 28th? That was looked at placard number 1.
Yes, it was.
I move to admit this is the next exhibit.
Any objection?
no, Your Honor.
It'll be marked and admitted as Exhibit 15.
And if I may approach with the second item.
You may.
I know I have a continuing, but I just want to,
I note your continuing objection to next item.
If you don't mind examining what's contained in that box. Is that familiar to you?
Yes, it is.
Is that what you collected at placard number 2 from 679 Moraine Street on January 28th, 2021?
Yes, it was.
Noting the continuing objection, it will be marked and admitted as Exhibit 16.
Trooper, what did you do with the 2 items that you collected that we just discussed?
So at the scene, they were photographed with a placard with a scale. They were placed into a container. That container was marked, and they were brought back to the Lakeville Crime Lab. They were entered into the LIM system, the evidence management system we had, and they are stored in Lakeville until I can process them.
And when an item is brought back to the lab to be stored, is it assigned a particular number that's different from the placard system that you've discussed?
Yes.
And you mentioned a system called LIMS.
Yes.
And so each particular item are they assigned a number in that LIMS system?
Yes, it's called an item number.
And as far as the first knife that was at placard number 1, when you entered that item into LIMS, it was given a number of 1-3, correct?
That's correct.
And as far as the second knife that was at placard number 2, when you entered that knife into LIMS, it was given an additional number, an item number.
Correct.
And what was that?
A 1-4.
Okay. And when the knives were at the lab, did you do anything in addition to analyze those knives as far as what your role is for crime scene services?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. After I completed it, are you asking?
So once you brought them back and you put the knives into the system, when you were at the lab, did you do anything to test those items?
Oh, yes, I did.
What did you do?
So what I did was when it gets to us first, initially I take the packaging, I photo the packaging. I take the evidence out, I photo the evidence, and then I processed both knives for fingerprints.
And so what is that process?
So
Difference.
depending on the type of evidence you have, we have different chemicals, different processes you use. In this situation with the 2 knives, essentially it's just it's placed into a chamber with a little plate. It's got super glue on it, and that super glue is heated up. And if there's any moisture or secretions from the fingers, that super glue will stick to that moisture.
And what is the purpose generally in processing items in this fashion to try to bring out a print?
It's to try to develop a fingerprint if it's not readily visible to the naked eye.
Are there circumstances in which fingerprints, you wouldn't be able to find a fingerprint or there wouldn't be enough information?
Yes.
And are there environmental factors that could affect the ability to recover a fingerprint from an object?
Yes.
What kinds of environmental factors are there?
Well, for example, if it's possible that fingerprints could be washed away, depending on where they're located. Other than that, outside of that, I can't speak to how long fingerprints will last out in an environment. There's not been any studies done on that. But
what about something about the condition of the item or how an item is handled or manipulated that could affect fingerprints? Are there circumstances that could affect the ability to get a fingerprint in those circumstances?
Yes.
And what kinds of circumstances might affect that?
Depending on, are you asking how it's handled when it's collected or just in general?
In general.
Yes, just in general. Depending on the type of surface, ideally smooth, non-porous surfaces like a smooth piece of plastic, that's going to be best to capture fingerprints on. When you encounter things like grips that are textured to prevent slipping, those are generally not conducive to developing and leaving fingerprints. If the person was wearing gloves, if depending on the amount of pressure that person uses while they're touching it, it might not transfer the secretions from the fingers onto the surface. So there are instances where you do not develop fingerprints. There's also instances where you do get fingerprints, but there's not enough. The term we use is minutia, but it's features within that fingerprint. You might not have enough to identify or exclude that fingerprint. We refer to that as a fingerprint of having no value.
And so in this particular circumstance, did you process both of the knives, items 1-3 and 1-4, for potential fingerprints?
Yes, I did.
And what were your conclusions?
On both items, we got no fingerprints of I got developed no fingerprints of value.
Now, after you processed those knives for fingerprints, what happened to the knives after that?
The knives were repackaged in a container and they were forwarded to what we refer to as CRIM for forensic testing. And
in this particular case, did you also have the occasion to go out to the Middleborough Police Station on January 28th, 2021, to photograph an individual at the Marshfield Police Station?
Marshfield Police Station, yes.
And who did you photograph there?
I photographed Ms. Ricci.
May I approach the witness?
You may.
I'm just showing you the first photograph. We can take a look at that.
Yes.
And what is that photograph?
That is a photograph of Ms. Ricci.
And you took that photograph on January 28th, 2021?
That's correct.
I would move to
Is there an objection to that photo?
No, Your Honor.
It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 17.
So I'm going to show you another photograph. What do you know that photograph to depict?
That is also a photograph of her hands.
Of her hands?
Yes.
And you took this on January 28th, 2021?
Correct.
I would move to admit this as the next exhibit, number 18, please.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
The photo of the hands will be marked as and admitted as Exhibit 18.
And one more.
Okay.
Familiar to you?
Yes.
And what do you know that photograph to depict?
That's a photograph of the wrist/forearm, I would say.
And that's of Ms. Ricci on January 28th, 2021?
Yes.
I would move to admit this.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
It'll be marked in a minute as Exhibit 19, a forearm shot.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Cross-exam.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
So do I understand this correctly that the surface that is most conducive to getting fingerprints are smooth plastic surfaces?
Not necessarily plastic. It could be glass or anything. Just a smooth, non-porous surface.
So resin also?
I'm sorry?
So those kind of resin also would be a smooth surface that would be readily able to pick up fingerprints?
Yes, as long as it's smooth and, again, non-porous and dry.
Okay.
You may.
Sir, would you describe the handle of what's called knife number 2, what you described as item number 1-4? That look like a smooth.
Just for the record, that's Exhibit 16. Is that right, counsel?
It is correct.
All right.
Is that what you would describe as a smooth resin handle?
Correct.
Now, you mentioned during direct examination that sometimes you have to put some substances on a fingerprint if they don't appear directly by the naked eye.
That's correct.
And that will sometimes help you determine if there's a fingerprint, even if you can't see it.
Correct, yes.
And that's true with other types of substances as well, like, for example, blood.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Well, so it's true, isn't it, that blood can be present and you might not even see it?
Yes, correct.
It's called occult blood, right?
I don't know the exact term for that. No.
Okay. But the point is that there can be such a small amount of blood that you can't see it with your naked eye, but there are certain reagents that you can put on something to make sure that there's blood on it.
Yes, correct.
And, of course, just because there's such a small amount of blood that you can't see it doesn't mean you can't test for that, right?
Correct.
And, make multiple samples because you use all sorts of chemical enhancers on the blood, right?
I'm sorry, you're asking about making samples of it?
Well, when they do DNA testing, they put usually the sample in some chemicals that amplify the sample, right?
I can't testify to DNA.
Okay. All right. When you saw the box of knives on the dining room table, correct?
Correct.
You said that your attention was drawn to one of them because you saw some staining on it. Is it correct?
I believe they described it as a substance. I'm not sure exactly how you would describe it, but that was the best I could do.
Okay. And you took photographs of the house, is that right?
Correct.
Inside the house, including photographs of a knife drawer in the kitchen. Is that right?
Correct.
May I approach one?
You may.
I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 10, the inside of that kitchen drawer.
Okay.
Is that the way that the kitchen drawer looked when you first opened it?
Are you asking if I moved anything around when I opened it?
Before that photograph?
No, I don't recall moving anything around. I just opened it and folded it.
Okay, and you would agree with me that the knife that is up in that sort of shadow area is facing the opposite direction as the knives that are in the holder. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And it's sort of, but that there are a number of utensils next to it that are facing that same direction as part of the.
Yes, correct. Yes, yes.
Yeah. And so as you open that drawer, obviously you don't know what the contents of the drawer look like before you open the drawer, correct?
Correct, yes.
And that knife is sort of right near where that pile of cutlery is that's facing in the very same direction as the knife, correct?
Yes, correct.
And what's been marked as exhibit number 11 now, that's a much clearer picture of the knife, correct?
Correct, yes.
But that's one that you had to move the knife in order to make the photograph.
Yes, to get a better photo, yes.
And it's clearly further down on the butcher block, and it's laid perfectly across, and you placed it there.
Yes.
You didn't mean anybody to infer that the placement of the knife in exhibit number 11 represents the way that the knife ever was when you were in the presence of it before you moved it.
Are you asking of that photo right there?
Exhibit 11.
No, that's just, it was photoed originally as is when I opened the drawer, and then that photo is when it was moved to get a better photo.
So this reflects your placement of it, not where it was placed.
Correct.
Anything else? Nothing further.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
The witness may step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Maybe approach.
Yes.
Claire.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the record?
Yes, my name is Madison Frank. Frank is spelled Frank.
Where are you employed, ma'am?
I'm employed with the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab in the DNA unit.
How long have you been employed by the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab?
I've been employed since October of 2019.
And what specific capacity are you employed?
I am employed as a forensic scientist 2.
And how long have you been a forensic scientist 2 for?
I've been a forensic scientist 2 since fall of 2020.
And prior to that, were you a forensic scientist 1?
Yes, I was.
What is a forensic scientist 1?
A forensic scientist 1 is how we're hired, and that is where we complete most of our laboratory training.
What is a forensic scientist 2?
A forensic scientist 2, you become a forensic scientist 2 once you've completed your laboratory training and you are authorized to perform casework.
Where'd you go to school?
I received a bachelor's of science from West Virginia University in forensic and investigative sciences.
And what, if any, specialized training do you have in forensics?
So in the DNA unit, we undergo a minimum of 6 months of training, and this includes both lectures and hands-on experience. And during that training, we will do all of that, process samples, and then at the completion of training, we will take a formal written exam, oral exam, and competency test.
Do you engage in any continuing education?
I do.
What's that?
Continuing education is a requirement by the FBI, and every DNA analyst must have a minimum of 8 hours of continuing education. And this can be completed through things like attending a training or a conference that keeps us up to date in advances in our field.
Now, what is the nature of your work?
As a forensic scientist do, I perform DNA analysis on either evidentiary samples or known samples, and then detail my analysis in a case file and report my results.
What is a competency test?
A competency test is that test that's administered at the end of our training, and it's used to make sure that all of the DNA analysts have the appropriate training and knowledge and skills to perform the test that we are being competency tested, trained in.
How often do you undergo a competency test?
We do a competency test once at the end of our training, and then there's proficiency tests that will come afterwards.
What's a proficiency test?
A proficiency test are tests that are administered by an outside agency, and these are tests that are taken twice a year throughout our entire employment to ensure our continued expertise in the items that we're authorized in.
And how often do you undergo a proficiency test, ma'am?
We take proficiency tests twice a year, starting from once you complete your competency test.
Now, have you taken competency and proficiency tests?
Yes, I have.
And what were the results of those?
I've successfully passed all of my competency and proficiency tests.
And in regards to your experience with the lab, how many samples have you performed DNA analysis methods on?
I performed DNA analysis on approximately 1,000 samples.
Now, you work for the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab.
Yes, I do.
Is that accredited?
It is accredited.
And who's it accredited by?
It's accredited by ANAB, and ANAB stands for AMC, which is another acronym for American National Standards Institute National Accreditation Board. And accreditation is a way to formally recognize that the lab is meeting or exceeding the standards that are provided by the accrediting body as well as the FBI.
And what does accreditation mean?
It's a way to formally recognize that we are meeting those standards that are put out by the FBI and the accrediting body.
And how long has your lab been accredited approximately?
The lab has been accredited since 2002.
Does your DNA unit follow standardized protocols and procedures?
Yes, our protocols and procedures are written in accordance with our accrediting body and the FBI standards that they put out for us.
And very briefly, can you just describe those in regards to your role? I'll rephrase that, strike that.
Thank you.
Do you use your protocols and procedures during your testing?
Yes, so for every step of our testing, every step has a protocol that we use and we follow in order to complete our testing.
And are controls used?
Yes.
What's a control?
Controls are a way for us to monitor how our test is working. So at the lab, we use both positive and negative controls with all of our samples that are tested. A positive control is a control in which we use a high quality DNA sample, and we know the expected profile that we should be getting at the end of testing. So that way, at the end of the testing, if we obtain that known DNA profile, then we know that all of our chemicals are working appropriately and that the testing was done completely and appropriately. We also have a negative control, which contains all of the chemicals that we use in our testing, but no DNA. So if at the end of testing, there is still no DNA present in that sample, then we know that we are using a clean technique and that the samples are free of contamination.
And does your lab undergo a review process of your work?
Yes, all case files are both technically and administratively reviewed. A technical review is a review of the file by an analyst to make sure that all of the data and the results that are being reported, that analyst can come to the same scientific conclusions and that all the protocols were followed during testing. We also then have an administrative review, which just reviews the file for any clerical, grammatical errors that may be present.
Okay. And what does DNA stand for?
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it is our genetic blueprint that our body uses in order to grow. You receive half of your DNA from your biological mother and half of your DNA from your biological father, and everybody's DNA profile will be unique with the exception of identical twins.
And what is a DNA profile?
A DNA profile is a series of numbers that we generate at the end of our testing.
How do you generate a DNA profile?
So our DNA analysis, and so those 4 steps are extraction, which is the first step, and that is when we're applying heat and chemicals to our samples to break open the cells and obtain the DNA. In our second step of quantitation, we are taking a small portion of that sample to determine how much DNA we have present in that sample. The third step is amplification, and that is when we are targeting very specific regions of DNA, and we are making millions of copies of those regions of interest. So that in our fourth step, all of those copies are different sizes. So in the fourth step of separation, we are now separating all of those millions of fragments by size. And then we're using a software to help visualize the DNA profile.
How many different types of DNA profiles can you develop during that process?
We at the crime lab go through 2 different tests to produce two different DNA profiles, an STR profile and a YSTR profile.
What is the difference between an STR profile and a YSTR profile?
STR stands for short tandem repeat, and an STR profile is looking at all the locations across your DNA in both males and females. So this is what's going to create your unique profile that is identical to you, with the exception of identical twins. A YSTR profile is only looking at male-specific DNA. So the YSTR profile is passed down through your paternal line. So a son, a father, a grandfather should all have the same YSTR profile.
And the Y comes from the Y chromosome. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is correct.
That's from males?
Yes.
What is a known sample?
A known sample is a sample where we know where the DNA came from. So this could be if you were to swab your mouth or draw blood from somebody, we know where the DNA is coming from.
And in addition to a known sample, what is a question sample?
A question sample is a sample where we don't know where the DNA is from. So this is something like an item of evidence from a crime scene.
Now, I want to direct your attention to this case while you're testifying before the court. This is in regards to lab number 21-02063. What was your role in this matter?
I performed DNA analysis on a known standard for this case.
And who was that known standard of?
It was the known standard for Michael Ricci.
And where was that known standard received from?
It was a known blood standard.
Okay. Now, as part of your analysis of that standard, what did you do?
I performed that 4-step process that I discussed earlier and was able to generate a DNA profile in the form of STRs.
Okay. And was that the results of your testing?
Yes. So I generated a full single source STR profile from the known blood standard of Michael Ricci.
Okay. What happens after you generate a profile?
After I generate a known profile, then I make an electronic copy that can be made available to the caseworking analyst for their use when they are ready for it.
And you mentioned you did that from the 4-step process?
Yes.
Just very briefly describe what you did to obtain that profile.
Yes. So from the known blood standard that I received, I underwent those 4 steps. So I first extracted that sample. I then did the second step of quantitation. So I'm figuring out how much DNA is present in the blood sample that I have. I then am amplifying it with 4 STRs. So we're amplifying DNA across all of the locations present in the DNA. And then I'm separating them in the 4th step with instrumentation to be able to separate all of those copies by their sizes, and then using a software to visualize that profile.
And then after you generated a profile, where did this go next? Where'd that profile go?
Once I completed my analysis, then I made a digital copy of it and I put it into our shared location where it is then stored.
Okay. And where it was stored, do you know who receives it next?
It's made available for the caseworking analyst. So I don't know when I put it up there who it's going to go to, but it is made available for whoever is working on the case.
And in this instance, do you recall who it went to next?
I'm not sure.
Now, is your work subject to review?
Yes, my work underwent both that technical and administrative review that I explained previously.
Okay. May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Nothing further. Thank you, ma'am.
Cross-exam.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon.
I take it that in this case you had a fairly limited role, correct?
That's correct.
Basically, you created a standard profile from Michael Ricci based on a blood sample that you received?
Yes, that is correct.
But you've done other work at the state lab, right?
Yes, I have.
Have you also been involved in the comparing of a known sample to, for example, a red-brown stain that was found at a crime scene?
In other cases, yes, I have.
Okay. And you are aware, are you not, that there's a distinction that's made between what's called a DNA analysis, where you compare a known standard to a red-brown stain, for example, and something called an exhaustive DNA analysis?
Yes, I am aware of the difference.
Okay. Can you explain what an exhaustive DNA analysis is?
So when we are processing when we are processing question samples, those are the items of evidence that are from crime scenes, we try to take no more than half of that sample and we preserve the other half for outside testing. But if we believe that there's not a lot of DNA present in the sample, it can be all of the sample can be used in order to try to get the most out of this DNA sample.
So if I have this right, an exhaustive analysis involves a situation in which, in order to compare a known sample, meaning from a profile from an individual, to a piece of evidence that was taken at a crime scene, an exhaustive situation would be one in which you can't make that comparison without destroying all of the DNA that's within the piece of evidence. So in other words, there isn't any left over to be tested by an outside agency or by a defendant.
The entire item of evidence is used up. So if you had something on a shirt, the entire stain on the shirt would be used, but there could be extra DNA extract. And before we will use all of it for testing, we will ask for permission before and receive permission before we use all of the sample, so that everybody is on the same page that this is all going to be used up during testing.
And that would be a situation in which there was so little DNA that it essentially was all being used, or would all have to be used during that testing. That's my only point.
Yes.
Right. Now, you talked about a process called amplification. That's step 3 in the process of creating a profile.
Yes, that is correct.
And that's where you take a small amount of DNA and you can reproduce it using a number of chemicals to the point where it's enough for you to make several profiles, right?
It makes enough so that we are able to hopefully visualize the profile using our software, yes.
Is that amplification process also used when, for example, you find a piece of evidence at the scene and there's clearly human DNA on it? Can they use amplification to increase the amount of that DNA so that it can be more easily compared to a known standard?
So both known items and question items will both undergo the same 4-step process. So both of them will undergo the same 4-step process, which includes the amplification, to be able to try to get an interpretable DNA profile.
So in an exhaustive situation, this would be a situation in which there was so little DNA on the item of evidence that even after amplification, there isn't enough left over to be able to have any left after the comparison's been made.
That is a potential that can happen in some of these items.
I have nothing further. Thank you.
Any redirect?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right. The witness may step down. Thank you. Commonwealth may call its next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Commonwealth calls Madeline Richardson, please.
Do solemnly swear that the testimony and the evidence that you give to the court and the jury and that now and in the Commonwealth and defendant bar from the truth, whole truth, and the truth of God.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Afternoon.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury, spelling your last name for the record?
My name is Madeline Richardson. Last name is Richardson. Where
are you employed now?
At the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab.
In what capacity?
I'm a forensic scientist 2 in the DNA unit.
How long have you been a forensic scientist 2 for?
I've been a forensic scientist 2 for almost 4 years.
And overall, how long have you been employed at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab?
For almost 5 years.
And what are your duties and responsibilities as an employee, as a forensic scientist 2 at the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab?
So I process items of biological evidence in the laboratory, and then I do data analysis on those items to develop a DNA profile, and then I will I'll generate reports with my conclusions and results, and I also do reviews of other analysts' work.
And what is your educational background?
I received a Bachelor of Science in Forensic Science at the Pennsylvania State University.
And can you describe to the jury your specialized training, please?
Yes. So for every technical skill that I'm authorized in, I received an in-house training process that where we would learn the procedures and protocols through a bunch of practice sets, and then they're all finished for every technical skill. It's finished with a written exam, an oral exam, and a competency test.
Now, you mentioned a competency test Have you undergone competency tests?
Yes, for every skill that I have.
And you also have undergone proficiency tests?
Yes.
And what were your results of those proficiency and competency tests?
Every proficiency test I have passed and every competency test I have passed.
Okay. Now, I want to direct your attention to this case where you're here testifying for. It's lab number, excuse me, I apologize, 2102063.
Correct.
What was
yes.
your role in this matter?
I developed the YSTR DNA profile for Michael Ricci.
Okay. And how did you do that?
So I did not perform the lab process, but the work product from Madison Frank, my colleague, was used in the YSTR amplification process to develop a YSTR profile. And then I did the analysis of that item.
So you used the STR profile that Ms. Frank created. Is that accurate?
Sorry. No, I was the work product, meaning the DNA, like the actual DNA that she produced in her lab processing was used in the lab processing for my YSTR profile.
Okay, can you describe what you did?
So once the lab processing was done, I received the electronic data and I interpreted that data and developed the DNA profile.
And did you use the 4-step process?
My place in it kind of started at the amplification process, which is the 3rd step in the 4-step process. So in the amplification process, we used a different test to create the YSTR profile, which is a different test than the STR.
And what is that test?
It's the same chemicals, same kind of reagents. It's just like looking at different locations on the DNA. So the STR looks at locations across the whole DNA of somebody, where a YSTR is male specific and just looks at locations on the Y chromosome.
And what is the importance or of the difference between a YSTR and an STR?
The importance is that YSTRs are male specific. So if there's any female in that sample, it will be kind of canceled out.
And where did this blood standard of Michael Ricci come from, if you know?
It was collected from Michael Ricci. I don't know exactly where from.
And what were your results of your analysis?
I developed a YSTR profile for Michael Ricci.
Okay. And then once you developed a YSTR profile of Michael Ricci, what did you do with it?
It's stored electronically, and then it was used by another analyst for comparison purposes to questioned items.
And was your work peer reviewed?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And that was administratively and technically?
Yes, it was.
May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Cross-exam?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah.
You created a Y chromosome profile for Michael Ricci in this case.
Correct, yes.
And a Y chromosome profile is basically a profile of Michael Ricci's Y chromosome DNA.
Yes, certain characteristics on the Y chromosome, yeah.
And if you sequenced it completely, Michael Ricci's Y chromosome DNA would be an exact copy, at least theoretically, of his father and going back in time, every male descendant of Michael Ricci going back father to father to father to father, correct?
Yes, a Y chromosome is paternally inherited. Barring any mutation, they should be the exact same.
Right. So mutations happen at random points during the genetic copying from father to son at certain points, but assuming no mutation, it's going to be the exact same grandfather, father, Michael Ricci, as well as Michael Ricci's sons are going to be the exact same Y chromosome profile, absent mutation.
Yes, that's true.
Now, you did the Y chromosome profile creation in this case, but you've done other things at the DNA lab, correct?
Yes, I have.
And you have training, obviously, in a broad number of subjects, all related to DNA testing.
Yes, I do.
And would you agree with me that we have DNA in our blood, correct?
Yes, we do.
We have DNA in our skin cells.
Yes.
And when we handle an object, our DNA cells can be transferred onto the item that we're touching.
Yes, that's true.
And some DNA can be transferred off that item, or it can be completely transferred off that item, but there can be DNA that remains on that item, and it can survive washing, for example.
Yes, it can.
And it can be on items for a long period of time after a person has touched them.
Yes, it can, but there's also some reasons why it would not be there. Just
And that would be case specific and circumstance specific, right?
of course, yes.
Yeah. But like, for example, under certain circumstances, there could be DNA on something for years, and it could be tested, and you could determine whose DNA it was if you had the right type of profile.
Yes.
I have nothing further. Thank you.
Any redirect?
Just very briefly, if I may, Your Honor.
Yes?
Ms. Richardson, can you just very briefly describe the reasons that DNA may not be on a specific item or may not be there, as you indicated on cross?
Yeah, just some factors are washing, wiping something off, or just the texture of an item can like hold on to DNA better than others. So there's a lot of factors that go into why or why not DNA can be detected on an item.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any recross?
So if an item that was touched by someone with, and their DNA was transferred onto the item, if there were, for example, ridges on that item that kept it from being fully cleaned, could that be a factor that could make the DNA remain on those ridges for longer, even after washing?
Yeah, that's possible.
Nothing further.
The witness may step down.
Thank you.
Are we exhausted with witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
All right. So jurors, as I told you a few minutes ago, that means that your day is coming to an end.